Okay, welcome to class. This is Lecture 1, Foundations of Context and Everyday Code Switching. So here we have our learning outcomes for Module 1. I'm not going to go through all of them. You have access to them here and on eCampus. But so we're going to be looking at some kind of foundational pieces of communication, understanding context, understanding formal and informal tones, and how you can start to adjust to be appropriate for different situations. So, why do we talk differently to a professor than to a roommate or to a supervisor or a friend? There's lots of different reasons for this, right? And so it's impacted by the formality of the situation or the relationship, the power dynamics that you have at play there, the social context that we have, the goals of the actual given communication. And so it just is really to emphasize the idea that communication is shaped by your context. And this is not only in your formal writing. Probably that's where you're more used to understanding that you need to use different tones, at least in the school environment. So it's really broadly impacted by context everywhere we go. So, what is context? It's the surrounding circumstances that influence, right? So they impact the meaning of what you're trying to get at. It can include the relationship, so the roles that we're playing, the age, the experience, the length of time somebody's been in a certain situation, that setting, that actual situation. So whether it is in written communication or if it's in person, if it's through kind of social media or these newfangled communication devices we have like phones, or through Zoom communication, or if it's sitting in a classroom. The purpose, if we're just asking a question, if we're apologizing, if we've offended somebody and we're trying to make up for that to kind of keep that relationship intact, if we're asking for information, if we're giving information, if we want feedback, and then tone, right? We have formal, we have relaxed, casual, all of these different possibilities. And so it's just some examples of the different types of context that you will experience, like at school, you're in the hallway on campus, or you're taking an online class and you're emailing. You will probably have different forms of perceived or acceptable communication in each of these. So, why do we code switch? There's lots of different reasons. Kind of the standard or the most well known reason for this kind of variation is survival and safety. And so that's how we've really, in the general population, come to understand code switching. You need to change the way that you are to fit a given environment to just make sure that you're not standing out or you're not causing disruptions, you're not creating problem. But it's more than that, right? It's not always with that kind of negative or fear-based motivation. It can also just be a way to like represent your culture, stay true to who you are, who you want to be, to the different communities that you want to be a part of. Code switching can kind of signify your belonging. But so what actually is it? Just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page here. Code switching is shifting between different languages, dialects, linguistic styles based on a given context. So at least when I was growing up, there was a movement to make African American English an actual like second language in schools. And so that was kind of when a lot of this idea of code switching kind of first came into the general consciousness in the US. And so it's also seen as like an accent, right? Like it's a different way of speaking the same language. So the movement to make it a second language didn't actually go very far, but it kind of cemented the idea that it is concretely different, but it's just like variation that we have in different contexts. And so it's appropriate in some, it's not appropriate in others. We all have linguistic styles, and those are shaped by our lived experiences, by our cultural memberships, by our age, and by the medium that we're using to share our message. So daily code switching, everyday code switching is just that shifting your tone, your vocabulary. It's not speaking another language. It's just communicating in different manners. And so if you're in your class and you want to raise your hand and ask the professor a question about an assignment, you would do that in one way. Where if you're asking the person sitting next to you, a fellow classmate, it's probably going to be done in a different way. When you're talking to an older person versus somebody who's your own age, you will have some differences there. So the key pieces of code switching are the register that you're using. So whether it's super formal or super casual or somewhere in between, your vocabulary choices, So you're going to use probably more formal language in one instance and less formal in another. And then the way that you're actually using your body to also shape that message. So, practical digital professionalism, this is one of the really important things for us to think about how we're communicating in these new online spaces in particular. I say new, they're not new, big picture new. So, when you're thinking about these in your actual lived experience, it's going to be emails versus text versus Teams, how you're addressing somebody, the way that you would actually approach them, doctor, professor, miss, Mrs., first name, using a nickname, when it's appropriate to use emojis and when it's not. There are a lot of instances where an emoji is actually wildly inappropriate. And so it's important to be able to understand that, be able to identify that yourself so you don't fall into making that sort of mistake. And so we can have too casual, we can have appropriate, we can have too formal, and we're going to get into all of those different styles. So when we're actually doing the communication, how do we do it? Look at the context. That's going to be the first thing that's going to guide you on your way. So think about, who is your audience? What is the relationship that you have with them? Maybe what is the relationship you want to have with them? And what is your purpose? And so you also want to think about the actual medium. So how are you going to do that communication? We understand the context. Now you have to understand the tools that you're going to be using. And then you want to be able to justify, at least to yourself, why you've selected that tone, that register. Why is it appropriate? And so this is going to be kind of like an internal audit that you have to get used to doing. So we're going to have lots of questions about understanding how to make the right choices in this class. And you, by the end of it, should be an expert at doing that kind of automatically in your brain. So the key takeaways from this first lecture are that communication choices reflect your understanding of social awareness and your purpose. So your context, like I've said, should be the main driver for everything. And you actively code switch, whether you've labeled it code switching before or not. I'm sure that it's something that you're doing and something you're probably quite good at doing. And so this class is going to be about how you operationalize that and make sure that you're always doing it the best way you can and in all the places that you need to. And so this is really important because this digital communication, the rules are very different, right? So more and more, I receive emails from students that look like they should be texts. And so sometimes I actually will have a Google Voice number that I'll give to students to text me questions. It's a little bit more accepted to use the more form or informal tone there, right, than it is in an email. An email is a letter still, so it should still have some of those conventions. So we're going to talk about how to understand how all of these different digital tools will have variation. So that's our first lecture. Hopefully all of that was interesting to you. So we're going to just kind of continue in the same vein as we move on to lecture 2.